There Was a Country by Chinua Achebe. Part 4. Nigeria's Painful Transitions, a Reappraisal. The post-Nigerian-Biafran Civil War era saw a unified Nigeria saddled with a greater and more insidious reality. We were plagued by a homegrown enemy. The political ineptitude, mediocrity, indiscipline, ethnic bigotry, and corruption of the ruling class. Compounding the situation was the fact that Nigeria was now awash in oil-borne petrol dollars. And to make matters even worse, the country's young, affable military head of state, General Yakubu Gowon, ever so cocksure following his victory, proclaimed to the entire planet that Nigeria had more money than it knew what to do with. A new era of great decadence and decline was born. It continues to this day. At this point, the intellectuals, particularly the writers, were faced with a conundrum. We could no longer pass off this present problem simply to our complicated past and the Cold War raging in the background, however significant these factors were. We could not absolve ourselves from the need to take hold of the events of the day and say, okay, we have had a difficult past. From today, this is the program we have. Let's not look at what we have not done. Of course, putting it this dramatically makes the matter appear simple. However, it became crystal clear that we needed to fight this new enemy with everything at our disposal. Most important, Nigeria needed to identify the right leader with the right kind of character, education, and background. Someone who would understand what was at stake, where Africa had been, and where it needed to go. For the second time in our short history, we had to face the disturbing fact that Nigeria needed to liberate itself anew, this time not from a foreign power, but from our own corrupt, inept brothers and sisters. After waiting around a while and determining that no Messiah was about to come down and save the day, some of us joined the political process. I joined the Left of Center People's Redemption Party and was appointed its deputy national president. The goal of being an active participant in Nigerian politics would be to elevate the national discourse to a level that stirred up the pot, if you like, and got Nigerians to begin to ask critical questions about their future, such as, how can the country conduct free and fair elections? How can we elect the right kind of leaders and ensure that they will keep to the tenure that was agreed upon? How do we ensure that our leaders don't double their tenure or even change it into a dynasty to hand over to their sons? My sojourn in politics was marked by disappointment, frustration, and the realization that despite the fact that there were a few upright political figures like Malam Aminu Kano, the vast majority of the characters I encountered in the political circles were there for their own selfish advancement. Having grand ideas was fine, but their execution required a strong leader, and clearly, Nigeria's principal problem was identifying and putting in place that elusive leader. That road to a remedy of Nigeria's political problems will not come easily. The key, as I see it, lies in the manner in which the leadership of the country is selected. When I refer to leadership, I am really talking about leaders at every level of government and sphere of society, from the local government council and governors right up to the presidency. What I am calling for is for Nigeria to develop a version of campaign election and campaign finance reforms so that the country can transform its political system from the grassroots level right through to the national party structures at the federal level. Nigerians will have to find a way to do away with the present system of godfatherism, an archaic, corrupt practice in which individuals with lots of money and time to spare, many of them half-baked, poorly educated thugs, sponsor their chosen candidates and push them right through to the desired political position, bribing, threatening, and on occasion murdering any opposition in the process. We will have to make sure that the electoral body overseeing elections is run by widely respected and competent officials chosen by a non-partisan group free of governmental influence and interference. Finally, we have to find a way to open up the political process to every Nigerian citizen. Today we have a system where only those individuals with the means of capital and who can both pay the exorbitant application fee and fund a political campaign can vie for the presidency. It would not surprise any close observer to discover that in this inane system, the same unsavory characters who have destroyed the country and looted the treasury and the nation blind are the ones able to run for presidency. The question of choice in selecting a leader in Nigeria is often an academic exercise due to the election rigging, violence, and intimidation of the general public, particularly by those in power, but also by those with the means, the rich and influential. There is also the unpleasant factor of the violence associated with partisan politics that is often designed to keep balanced, well-educated, fair-minded Nigerians away. So it can be said that the masses, the fellowship we are concerned about, don't really have a choice of leadership because there is not a true democratic process. It may appear impossible now to rectify because we've allowed the situation of confusion to go on since our independence. It has been growing steadily worse, and it accelerated particularly under the military when there was a near total denial of the democratic rights of the people. The general knowledge that a people have, for example, inalienable rights is simply something advanced societies take for granted because they have fostered stable democracies now for some time. I am asked, why don't the people fight back? Well, once a people have been dispossessed and subjugated by dictatorships for such a long time as in Nigeria's case, the oppressive process also effectively strips away from the minds of the people the knowledge that they have rights. Restoring flawed democratic systems will not make the country a success overnight. The Igbo are a very democratic people. The Igbo people expressed a strong anti-monarchy sentiment, Ezebwilo, which literally means a king is an enemy. Their culture illustrates a clear-cut opposition to kings because I think the Igbo people had seen what the uncontrolled power of kings could do. There is no doubt that in their history they experienced the high-handedness of kings, so they decided that a king cannot be a trusted friend of the people without checks and balances. And they tried to construct all kinds of arrangements to whittle down the menace of those with a will to power, because such people are there in large numbers in every society. So the Igbo created all kinds of titles that cost much to acquire. Aspirants to titles in the end become impoverished in the process and end up with very little. So that individual begins again, and by the time his life is over, he has a lot of prestige but very little power. Democracy is the very antithesis of military or absolutist rule. And democracy is not a fancy word, it is something that is full of meaning, even in our ancient African cultures. Dictatorships, by their very nature, concentrate power and the resources of the state in the hands of a very few people, or as we have seen in Africa, in one person's hand. Dictators hang on to power by resorting to tactics designed to keep the mass of the people silent and docile. Dictatorships that have used violence, murder, and bribery, and psychological, financial, and social intimidation to force the opposition into perpetual retreat are many and widespread. This is not a time to bemoan all the challenges ahead. It is a time to work at developing, nurturing, sustaining, and protecting democracy and democratic institutions. Winston Churchill perceptively said, "Democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. We have to go by that wisdom. Therein lies an opportunity for Great Britain, America, and the West to be involved positively in African affairs, this time not by imposing themselves or their self-selected rulers on a desperate continent, but by aiding African nations in their struggles to become viable democracies. We also realize that we must learn patience and not expect instant miracles. Building a nation is not something a people does in one regime or even in a few years. It is a very long process. The Chinese had their chance to emerge as the leading nation in the world in the Middle Ages, but were consumed by inter-ethnic political posturing and wars and had to wait another 500 years for another chance. Another crucial ingredient in sustaining a democracy is the ability to stage free and fair elections. The last general election in Nigeria was not perfect, but overall it was an improvement over past travesties that were passed off as elections in Nigeria. The Independent National Electoral Commission (INEC) chairman and Professor Atahiru Mohammed Jega and his team should be allowed to build upon the gains of that exercise for the good of the nation. I think it is important to discuss some real events that occurred during Nigeria's Fourth Republic, circa 2004, during which the very opposite of the democratic ideal was at work. Anambra State, the past home of several venerated Nigerians such as Nnamdi Azikiwe, the Yakubu brothers Pius and Christopher, Kenneth Dike and others, was literally and figuratively on fire. There was a succession of events during a tussle for political power that resulted in renegades arresting a sitting governor and buildings being looted and government property ransacked and burned to the ground by hoodlums, those infamous rent-a-crowd hooligans at the beck and call of corrupt politicians with plenty of money and very low IQ. What seemed almost incredible to me was that it was clear from all accounts that the presidency was behind the chaos in the state, was encouraging the destabilization of the government of Anambra State, as well as encouraging a small group of people whose sole interest seemed to be in getting their hands on the financial allocation made to the state. In other words, to use the money that was intended for work on the state for their own private ends, and that these were friends of the president. For any clear-headed observer, such a scenario would be unimaginable, that the head of state or his government or his office should be encouraging crime in one of the Federation's constituent states, encouraging anarchy in a part of the country, Nigeria. That state, of course, as you might know, is also my home state. It's also part of Igbo land, which has had a peculiar history in Nigeria, some of which involves this particular former president of Nigeria, his attitude to this part of Nigeria, which he and some like him consider responsible for the troubles of the Nigerian Civil War. And so, it just seemed to me totally irresponsible for leadership to be involved, to be promoting chaos instead of preventing it. It was, in a sense, the very end of government itself, where government leaps beyond the precipice, dismisses itself, and joins ranks with crime. I decided that I wasn't going to be part of any of this. Eliwiso reminds us, there may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest. I had very little at my disposal to protest with, so the strongest statement I could make was to turn down the honor of Commander of the Federal Republic, which I was awarded. Corruption and indiscipline. Corruption in Nigeria has grown because it is highly encouraged. In the trouble with Nigeria, I suggest Nigerians are corrupt because the system they live under today makes corruption easy and profitable. They will cease to be corrupt when corruption is made difficult and unattractive. 28 years after that slim book was published, I can state categorically that the problem of corruption and indiscipline is probably worse today than it's ever been, because of the massive way in which the Nigerian leadership is using the nation's wealth to corrupt, really to destroy the country, so no improvement or change can happen. Recently, out of despair, I stated, corruption in Nigeria has passed the alarming and entered the fatal stage, and Nigeria would die if we continue to pretend that she is only slightly indisposed. The World Bank recently released numbers indicating that about $400 billion has been pilfered from Nigeria's treasury since independence. One needs to stop for a moment to wrap one's mind around that incredible figure. This amount, $400 billion, is approximately the gross domestic product of Norway and of Sweden. In other words, Nigeria's corrupt ruling class stole the equivalent of the entire economy of a European country in 4 decades. This theft of national funds is one of the factors essentially making it impossible for Nigeria to succeed. Nigerians alone are not responsible. We all know that this corrupt cabal of Nigerians in power has friends abroad who not only help it move the billions abroad and help them hide the money, but also shield the perpetrators from prosecution. State failure and the rise of terrorism. In 2011, Nigeria was ranked number 14 in the Failed State Index, just below other havens of stability, Afghanistan, Somalia, and Iraq. State failure has many definitions, so I will bother the reader with only 2 short descriptions relevant to the Nigerian situation. A failed state is one that is unable to perform its duties on several levels. When violence cascades into an all-out internal war, when standards of living massively deteriorate, when the infrastructure of ordinary life decays, and when the greed of rulers overwhelms their responsibilities to better their people and their surroundings. Failed states are seen in instances in which central state authority collapses for several years. Economic deprivation and corruption produce and exacerbate financial and social inequities in a population, which in turn fuel political instability. Within this environment, extremists of all kinds, particularly religious zealots and other political mischief makers, find a foothold to recruit supporters and sympathizers to help them launch terrorist attacks and wreak havoc in the lives of ordinary citizens. Over 800 deaths, mainly in northern Nigeria, have been attributed to the militant Islamic sect Boko Haram since its formation in 2002. The group's ultimate goal, we are told, is to overthrow the Nigerian government and create an Islamic state. In many respects, Nigeria's federal government has always tolerated terrorism. For over half a century, the federal government has turned a blind eye to waves of ferocious and savage massacres of its citizens, mainly Christian Southerners, mostly Igbos or indigenes of the Middle Belt, and others with impunity. Even in cases where their hands were found dripping in blood, the perpetrators have many a time evaded capture and punishment. Nigeria has been doomed to witness endless cycles of inter-ethnic, inter-religious violence because the Nigerian government has failed woefully to enforce laws protecting its citizens from wanton violence, particularly attacks against non-indigenes living in disparate parts of the country. The notoriously, some say conveniently so, incompetent Nigerian federal government and some religious and political leaders have been at least enablers of these evil acts. I have stated elsewhere that this mindless carnage will end only with the dismantling of the present corrupt political system and banishment of the cause of mediocrity that runs it, hopefully through a peaceful democratic process. State resuscitation and recovery. Many pundits seek a direct link between crude oil and corruption in Nigeria that's putting in place an elaborate system preventing politicians or civilians from having access to petrodollars is probably a major part of a series of fixes needed to reduce large-scale corruption. For most people, the situation is straightforward. If you commit a crime, you should be brought to book. Hold people responsible for misconduct and punish them if they are guilty. In a country such as Nigeria, where there are no easy fixes, one must examine the issue of accountability, which has to be a strong component of the fight against corruption. Every Nigerian knows that there should be accountability, that people should be accountable. But if the president, the person running the whole show, has all of the power and resources of the country in his control, and he is also the one who selects who should be probed or not, clearly, we will have an uneven system in which those who are favored by the emperor have free rein to loot the treasury with reckless abandon, while those who are disliked or tell the emperor that he is not wearing any clothes get marched swiftly to the guillotine. Nigeria's story has not been entirely one long, unrevealed history of despair. 50 years after independence, Nigerians have begun to ask themselves the hard questions. How can the state of anarchy be reversed? What are the measures that can be taken to prevent corrupt candidates from recycling themselves into positions of leadership? Young Nigerians have often come to me desperately seeking solutions to several conundrums. How do we begin to solve these problems in Nigeria, where the structures are present, but there is no accountability? Other pressing questions include: how does Nigeria bring all the human and material resources it has to bear on its development? How do we clean up the Niger Delta? What do we need to do to bring an end to organized ethnic bigotry? How can we place the necessary checks and balances in place that will reduce the decadence, corruption, and debauchery of the past several decades? How can we ensure even and sustained development, and so forth? And that would be a big debate to keep Nigeria busy for a long time. The Sovereign National Conference that was held a couple of years ago was a good idea. I believe the concept was right, a platform to discuss Nigeria's problems and challenges and pave a path forward. However, the execution was not. Debate about a nation's future should not turn into an excuse for politicians to drink or feast on meals in Abuja. It should continue for decades, in small forums, in schools, offices, on the radio, on TV, in markets, in our newspapers, and on the streets, until we get things right. Most advanced nations in the world constantly appraise and reappraise their country's path and destinies. I foresee the Nigerian solution will come in stages. First, we have to nurture and strengthen our democratic institutions and strive for the freest and fairest elections possible. That will place the true candidates of the people in office. Under the rubric of a democracy, a free press can thrive and a strong justice system can flourish. The checks and balances we have spoken about and the laws needed to curb corruption will then naturally find a footing. A new patriotic consciousness has to be developed, not one based simply on the well-worn notion of the unity of Nigeria or faith in Nigeria often touted by our corrupt leaders, but one based on an awareness of the responsibility of leaders to the led, on the sacredness of their anointment to lead, and disseminated by civil society, schools, and intellectuals. It is from this kind of environment that a leader, humbled by the trust placed upon him by the people, will emerge willing to use the power given to him for the good of the people. After a war. After a war, life catches desperately at passing hints of normalcy like vines entwining a hollow twig. It famished roads, clothes, and rubble, and every piece of broken glass. Irritations we used to cause return to joyous tables like prodigals home from the city. The meter man serving my maiden bill brought a friendly face to my circle of sullen strangers and me smiling gratefully to the door. After a war, we clutch at watery scum pulsating on listless eddies of our spent deluge. Convalescent dancers rising too soon to rejoin their circle dance, our powerless feet intent as before but no longer adept contrive only half-remembered eccentric steps. After years of pressing death and these last hour reprieves, we are glad to dump our fears and our perilous gains together in one shallow grave and flee the same rueful way we came straight home to haunted reverie. Postscript. The example of Nelson Mandela. Not too long ago, my attention was caught by a radio news item about Africa. As I had come to expect, it was not good news, and it was not presented with, nor did it deserve respect. It was something of a joke. This was the announcement of the death of President Eyadema of Togo, whom it described as the longest-serving president in Africa, or maybe the world, I forget which. Then it gave another detail. Eyadema had died from a heart attack, even as he was about to be flown to Europe for treatment. And it concluded with the information that Eyadema's son would succeed him as the next president of Togo. If Eyadema stayed that long because he was so good, why was there no hospital in Togo to attend to his condition? Did Eyadema, who had given nothing but bad news to Togo since 1960s, imagine that the solution to problems created largely by him would be solved by a dynasty of Eyademas? Which reminded me of another first son, the son of the president of Equatorial Guinea, who was seen around the world on television as he shopped extravagantly in Paris for expensive clothes. Unfortunately, he seemed no less a bum in the suit he was trying on than out of them. This even brought me once again face to face with Africa's leadership charade. What do African leaders envision for their countries and their people? I wonder yet again, have they not heard that where there is no vision, the people perish? Does the judgment of history on their rule mean anything to them? Do they remember how a man called Mandela, who had spent 27 years in prison in South Africa, gave up the presidency of that country, a position that he so richly deserved, after only 4 years, and made way for another younger patriot? Why do African leaders choose bad models like Malawian President Kamuzu Banda instead of good ones like Mandela? Have they considered how Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe had ruined the course of land distribution by demagoguery and a 30-year tenancy in power? Which makes me wonder whether any of these life presidents consider how Mandela became the beacon of justice and hope on the continent, indeed for the world. For those who do not know, Mandela did not have an easy life. He fought alongside African heroes such as Steve Biko, Walter Sisulu, and Oliver Tambo, among other brave activists, for the liberation of his people from one of the most racist systems the world has ever known. For his efforts, he was sent to prison. Most men would have been broken or consumed by bitterness, but not Mandela. This giant among men walked free that fateful day on February 11, 1990, after nearly 3 decades of imprisonment on Robben Island, hands held high, fist in the air. His release was beamed across the planet. The world was pleased, but nowhere as ecstatic as his African brethren around the globe, who saw in Mandela the personification of their highest aspirations and the embodiment of the kind of leadership Africa needs desperately. Mandela has delivered magnificently on those dreams. And it is to this great man, lovingly known as Madiba, father of the nation of South Africa, anti-apartheid leader, lawyer, writer, intellectual, humanitarian, that present and future African leaders must all go for sustenance and inspiration. Appendix: Brigadier Banjo's broadcast to Midwest. Note: Brigadier Banjo was the commander of the Biafran invasion. Benin, August 14, 1967, at 20 GMT. Fellow Nigerians and Biafra, I am sure I do not need to introduce myself either to you nor perhaps to many people outside our country. You have already had ample opportunity to hear of my name in January 1966, when this political crisis started in our country. Unfortunately, at that time, I also only heard about the circumstances under which my name was being publicized at a time when I was in no position to do anything about it. I was then accused of having attempted the life of the late Supreme Commander, Major General J.T.U. Aguiyi-Ironsi, and that for the attempt I have been arrested and detained. Fellow Nigerians, nothing could be further from the truth. The mutiny in the army which started the revolution in January 1966 was as much of a surprise to myself as it was to some of my colleagues. I spent all of my time of the events in ascertaining the true state of affairs in the country. My colleague, then Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, was the first officer who gave me precise information about the state of affairs. It then appeared to me that sufficient had taken place to ensure the removal of several governments of the Federation, and that the sum total of the trend of events could be regarded as the beginning of a national revolution. I then considered it my duty to ensure that no further military action took place which might have the effect of totally destroying the stability of the nation. I felt that the young officers who had started the action were only anxious to destroy what had become a most corrupt and discredited government. As such, I spent a considerable time in an effort to urge the late Major General to assume responsibility for the state with the support of the army from national collapse. It was then my view that any attempt to use the Nigerian army for any military action within Nigeria would only have the effect of breaking the army into its tribal components, of which the northern component would represent the lion's share. This northern component, effectively under the control of the northern feudalists, would then inevitably be employed to impose on the rest of Nigeria the most repressive feudal domination. I was one of the senior officers of the Nigerian army who took the decision to accept responsibility for Nigeria. In fact, on that occasion, I was the chief spokesman for that decision. I therefore considered it my duty to remain with the general as closely as possible rather than accept the office of the military governor of the West, which he then proposed to me and which I declined in favor of the late Lieutenant Colonel Adekunle Fajuyi. On the day after the general had assumed full responsibility for the state, I was arrested by a few of my colleagues while waiting to see the general. I was never given a reason for my arrest, nor given any opportunity to defend myself against any charges that could be raised. I went to prison for 14 months under a false accusation, the details of which I only found out from the press and radio after I got to prison. I have since had the opportunity of speaking to the so-called actors in that drama of my arrest, and I now appreciate that the action was an act of hatred motivated primarily by fear and suspicion. I spent a considerable part of my time in prison sending warnings to the late Major General and my colleagues about the policies that would appear to represent a continuation of the policies of the Balewa government, which could have the effect of encouraging counter-attempts, which might not only destroy the Nigerian army, but would also, by the extent of the bloodshed and the tribal selectiveness of destroy the Nigerian nation as well. The inevitable has now happened, which would seem to confirm that my fears were well founded. There is now an army at the disposal of the feudal knot, an army that has lost all the traditions, discipline, and standards of a responsible army. There is now a government of the Federation that is sustained by violence and is therefore tied to the ambitions of the Northern Federalists. There has been a considerable amount of bloodshed, chaos, and tribal bitterness among such people. Such tribal rivalry as used to be exploited by our previous political parties for the harnessing of the opinions of the North and its people is now translating itself into a most extreme form of brutality and of despicable savagery. Finally, the dismemberment of our nation has commenced in the breakaway of Biafra. In August 1966, I wrote to my colleagues from prison to inform them that I did not consider that we, military leaders of this country, have the right to carry out such action as the proclamation of the dismemberment of presiding over the dismemberment of Nigeria. I still do not think that we have the right to destroy a nation that was handed over to us to save at a moment of crisis. The 29th July 1966 federal military government came into being as a result of a mutiny in which the primary action was directed at the elimination of a particular ethnic group and the supremacy of another ethnic group in Nigeria. These had the effect of destroying the basic mutual trust and confidence among the people of Nigeria and has created the decentralization of the Nigerian people into tribal groups. This action, more than any other event that has occurred throughout the history of Nigeria, has had the greatest effect on the dismemberment of Nigeria. The federal military government cannot claim to represent the government of the people of Nigeria and to fight for the unity of Nigeria, while constantly rejecting fundamental human rights for all people forming parts of Nigeria. The federal military government cannot claim to be seeking a peaceful solution to the problems of achieving Nigerian unity, while at the same time contemptuously ignoring the wishes of the people of the Midwest and the West in their previous demands for the removal of the unruly troops of the North from their territories in order to allow the unfettered discussion of the present political crisis. The federal military government cannot claim to be genuinely interested in the progress and welfare of the Nigerian people, while at the same time inflicting the bloodless warfare on the people of Nigeria and employing unscrupulous foreign mercenaries in a total war that really destroys hundreds of our people and the economy of our nation. The people of Biafra have a right to fight a government that has constantly treated its people to the most savage forms of brutality and persists in denying these people its fundamental human rights while claiming to represent other interests. It is my view that the people of Biafra were prepared to remain part of the nation into which they have for so many years invested their resources of manpower and material, and with which they had the closest social ties. Provided the people of Biafra could live within such a nation under a government that truly represents all sections of its people and truly tries to pursue such measures as are designed to promote the welfare of all Nigerians irrespective of tribe or religion, sentence as broadcast. It is the remnant of the old Nigerian army that broke away in July that now threatens the Nigerian nation. This Northern Army is now under the power and control of a group of Northern feudalists who have as their aim the total conquest of Nigeria. The federal military government, having been brought to power and control by that army, is playing to that end. Hence, policies are inevitably directed toward achieving the objectives of the Northern feudalists who control that army. It is my idea that the peaceful settlement of the Nigerian problem will be readily achieved when that fragment of the Nigerian army, now at the disposal of the Northern feudalists, has been completely disarmed. Towards this end, the Liberation Army is irrevocably committed. It is not at all an invasion. It is not intended to promote the denomination of any group of the Nigerian people by any other group through the presence of the Liberation Army. I wish to stress once again what I said during the press conference and previously on the radio, that the movement of this army into the Midwest is not a conquest. It is also not an invasion. It is to enable the people of the Midwest to see the Nigerian problem in its proper perspective. I firmly believe that the people of the Midwest would prefer to be able to declare their stand in the conflict that has arisen in Nigeria, free from any pressure either from the North or from anywhere. I believe that the people of the Midwest would like to be given an opportunity to state their case free from the coercive influences due to the presence of Northern troops. It is my view that the political future of Nigeria rests with all the people of Nigeria. It has become a matter of great concern to me, however, to be informed that certain ethnic groups are jubilating as a result of the presence of the Liberation Army in this region. As a consequence, I also understand that certain other ethnic groups are feeling depressed and frustrated. I wish to assure all ethnic groups in the Midwest that the achievements of the Liberation Army does not give any ethnic group an advantage over any other. I wish also to appeal to all ethnic groups to exercise restraint and humility and not to indulge in any acts which may result in confusion, bringing distress to a large number of our people. Any misbehavior on the part of any group of persons will give rise to a chain of unpleasant reactions. I am informed that since the Liberation Army came into the Midwest, a number of civil servants have become so frightened that they have either refused to come to their places of work or reported only for a few hours and then left before the closing time. I wish to take this opportunity to appeal to all civil servants to return to work not later than 15th August 1967 and to assure them of their safety. Those, however, who fail to report on this day will be in danger of permanently losing their jobs. While on the question of cooperation among the various ethnic groups in the Midwest, I would like to stress that all tribal meetings should stop, as such meetings are not conducive to peace and mutual understanding. In order to foster cooperation among the people of the Midwest, I propose within the next few days to invite a cross-section of the people of the Midwest to a meeting to explain to them the present situation and objectives of the Liberation Army, and I believe this will go a long way to giving them the true picture of the situation and instill confidence in the future of the Midwest. I understand that anxiety is being expressed in some quarters about the safety of the military governor of the Midwest, Brigadier David Ejo. I wish to inform you that I have personally held discussions with Brigadier Ejo and to assure you that he is in good health and is not under detention. I have, therefore, today promulgated a decree setting up an interim administration in Midwestern Nigeria. This decree has suspended the operation in Midwestern Nigeria of the Constitution of the Federation of Nigeria, the Constitution of Midwestern Nigeria, and other constitutional provisions applicable in Midwestern Nigeria, except those constitutional provisions absolutely necessary for the efficient functioning of the machinery of states. All legislative and executive powers have been vested in me during the period of interim administration. In order to assist me in the task of administering Midwestern Nigeria during the interim period, I propose to appoint a military administrator and an administrative council. I have also established a Midwestern Nigerian Army and a Midwestern Nigerian Police Force, which will, for the moment, remain independent of the Nigerian Army, the Nigerian Police Force, the Biafran Army, or the Biafran Police Force. The Midwestern Nigerian Army shall, however, during this interim period be part of the Liberation Army. All courts in Midwestern Nigeria shall continue to function as usual, and it may be necessary to establish a court of appeal until it becomes possible to resume the Supreme Court of Nigeria. As soon as it is practicable, I propose to hand over the administration of Midwestern Nigeria in order to proceed to the war front and to complete the liberation of Nigeria. Good night.